August 7, 1944, a little before dawn. On the summit of a rocky hill in Normandy that the American maps labeled 314, a 21-year-old second lieutenant from Indiana named Robert Weiss was lying behind a low wall of loose stones, pressing a radio handset against his ear and trying to keep his voice flat. The officer he was talking to was several kilometers behind him, in the fire direction center of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion. Weiss was reading out a string of map coordinates. He had been doing this for roughly 4 hours, which is to say since he first saw, through binoculars in the grey pre-dawn light, the outlines of German tanks moving along a road in the valley below him. He did not know it that morning, but the 4 Panzer divisions rolling up the road in front of his observation post represented almost every armoured vehicle the German army could still move in western France. He did not know that Adolf Hitler had personally ordered the attack over the objection of his own field commanders. He did not know that British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, reading decoded radio traffic from the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, had warned General Omar Bradley a few hours earlier, and that Bradley had told his subordinates, in words the official history would later preserve, that it was too late to do anything except fight. What Weiss knew was simpler. He knew that the infantry battalion he was attached to, the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, was cut off. He knew their commanding officer was dead. He knew the senior surviving officer, a captain named Reynold Erichson, had taken over a patchwork of riflemen out of food, almost out of water, and short on radio batteries. And he knew that the one thing standing between those men and a German armoured division was the radio in his hand. What none of the Germans in the valley could quite understand, as the shells began to come in, was how an American artillery battery several kilometers away, with no line of sight to the road, no spotting aircraft in the sky above the fog, no advance warning of their movement, could drop the fire of multiple batteries onto a specific stretch of pavement at a specific minute, so precisely that the first salvo always came down before the officers in the lead vehicles could give the order to scatter. A German officer captured later that month, interrogated by the American 7th Army, tried to describe what he had been through at Mortain. He said the Americans did not fire artillery in the way his training had prepared him for. The shells came without the usual ranging rounds. There was no build. The coordinated fire of multiple batteries arrived in a single sudden impact, and then again, and then again. An officer of a first-rate army, trained in Poland and France and Russia, was trying to tell his captors that something had happened to him for which his 5 years of war had not prepared him. This is the story of why, by the late summer of 1944, German soldiers on the Western Front had come to believe something their own professional training told them should not be possible. They had come to believe that American artillery could not be survived if it found you in the open. And it is the story of why that belief was, for a specific set of technical and organizational reasons most of those Germans never quite worked out, almost correct. It is also a story with a beginning that runs nowhere near Normandy. It begins in a prairie classroom in Oklahoma, in the late 1920s, when a major named Carlos Brewer looked at the way the entire world was doing artillery and decided that the entire world was doing it wrong. Start with the oldest rule of artillery. Since the moment guns began firing at targets the gunner could not see with his own eyes, the central problem of the whole business had been the same problem. The man at the gun did not know where the enemy was. The man at the front who could see the enemy did not know how to tell the gun. Every army in the world, from the late 1860s onward, had solved this the same way. You assigned a battery to an infantry unit. You gave it a sector. When something moved in that sector, an observer at the front walked the shells onto it one round at a time, correcting by voice or by wire. The system was slow because it had to be. Every gun on the battlefield was, in effect, a private contractor working for one customer. If a bigger target appeared and you wanted more fire on it, your request had to travel up a chain of command, be approved, routed to another unit, and calculated from scratch by a different set of gunners. By the time all that was done, the target had usually moved, or it had become a different target, or it was gone. The Germans accepted this, the French accepted it, the British accepted it, the Russians accepted it. Nobody had a better idea, and the one time anybody had tried to centralize artillery on a large scale, in the trenches of the First World War, it had required days of preparation and rigid timetables that could not change once the battle began. Carlos Brewer was born in 1890 in a small Kentucky farming community. He graduated from West Point with the class of 1913, 15th in his class, and he spent most of the 1920s doing the kind of quiet staff work that does not produce generals quickly. In 1928 he came to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which at the time was not a glamorous posting. It was a dusty post on the southern plains, with few students, almost no guns, and a budget a single modern division would have laughed at. Its field artillery school existed mostly because the army had to put the school somewhere. What it had was Brewer, and a small circle of instructors around him who believed the same thing Brewer believed. They believed the gun was not the unit of artillery. The target was the unit of artillery. A target, they argued, did not care which battery shot at it. A target cared about how many shells arrived, how quickly, and whether it had time to take cover before the shells came down. If you could find a way to make every gun within range shoot at a target at the same time, regardless of which infantry unit each gun was formally assigned to, you would produce something no army in the world had ever produced. You would not be firing a fire mission. You would be producing a single coordinated event. In the spring of 1931, Brewer conducted the first large-scale demonstration of what he was proposing. An entire battalion of guns, dispersed across a wide training area, massed its fire on a single target in a single concentrated strike. It was not an original idea in the abstract. Other armies had considered it. The difference was that Brewer and his instructors were building a system to make it routine, repeatable, and fast, in a way that did not require the genius of the battery commander. The next director of the gunnery department, a major named Orlando Ward, took Brewer's demonstrations and institutionalized them. Ward developed the Fire Direction Center. The Fire Direction Center was not a gun position. It was a plywood room, or in combat a tent, containing a map, a radio, a telephone switchboard, and a small team of officers and enlisted men whose only job was to take a single call from a single forward observer and convert it, in a matter of minutes, into a coordinated fire order for every battery within range. Ward would later command the 1st Armored Division in Tunisia, be relieved by Patton after Magnacy, and return to Fort Sill as the school's commandant. The Fire Direction Center went with him. By the early 1940s, the Americans had added the last piece. An officer named Abbott Burns, working with Major George Keyser, developed what was called the graphic firing table. It was a printed strip of cardboard, nothing elaborate. On it were pre-computed curves for every combination of range, weather, powder, temperature, altitude, and barrel wear a gun might encounter. A gunner, instead of doing 15 minutes of ballistic calculation from scratch, could read his firing data directly off the printed strip in under a minute. Behind the strips, in a room at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, hundreds of women were running mechanical calculators and slide rules, generating the curves for every possible variation. The Americans had taken a process the rest of the world did by hand, by the craftsmanship of trained gunners, and industrialized it. The women at Aberdeen deserve their own paragraph here, because they were a piece of this system that the popular histories of the war have mostly forgotten. They were called computers in the original and literal sense of the word, which is to say that they were the people who did the computing. Most of them were mathematics graduates from women's colleges on the East Coast, hired on civilian contracts because the men who would otherwise have done the work had been drafted. Their job was to run, by hand, the ballistic calculations that produced the curves the gunners at the front would later read off their cardboard strips. A single trajectory, for a single shell, under a single set of atmospheric conditions, could take a woman with a mechanical desk calculator something like 20 hours to compute. Aberdeen produced thousands of such trajectories. Later in the war, some of the same women would be retrained to operate the first general-purpose electronic computer, ENIAC, which had been built partly for exactly this purpose. But the graphic firing tables that were in the hands of American gunners in Normandy had been calculated before ENIAC existed. They had been calculated by women sitting at desks. No other army had any of this. The Germans, who had the most professional artillery officer corps in Europe, had rejected centralized fire control as impractical. Their doctrine emphasized the expert judgment of the battery commander, the man at the gun, making his own decisions. The British had a fast regimental-level fire system that could bring a regiment's worth of guns onto a target in about 3 minutes, and they had been running time-on-target missions of their own in North Africa since 1942. The Russians had massive artillery, far more guns than the Americans would ever field, but they used them the old way, in planned barrages on planned timetables. Nobody had what the Americans were quietly building, which was an on-demand fire network that could, within minutes of a single radio call, put the concentrated output of dozens of guns onto a piece of ground the size of a farmhouse. The first real test of that system against a determined first-rate opponent came at Mortain, in the first week of August 1944. But before Mortain, there was Cobra, and Cobra has to be mentioned here, because Cobra is where the Germans on the Western Front first understood what they were actually fighting. Operation Cobra was General Omar Bradley's plan to break out of Normandy. The American First Army had been stuck in the hedgerows south of the D-Day beaches for 6 weeks, taking casualties the Army Chief of Staff had not budgeted for, against a German defence that had turned every hedge into a separate killing ground. Bradley's solution, approved in mid-July, was to pick a narrow strip of front roughly 6 kilometres wide, concentrate an unprecedented weight of air power and artillery on it, and ram 3 infantry divisions and 2 armoured divisions through the whole. The artillery component of Cobra was the single largest American artillery concentration in the war up to that point. Over 1,000 guns fired on the target strip. Some estimates, including those from the Panzer Lehr Division, which was on the receiving end, put the figure closer to 1,200. The fire plan was a continuous series of time-on-target concentrations, meaning that every battery involved had been timed so that its rounds landed simultaneously on its assigned portion of the target area. What the Panzer Lehr Division experienced on the morning of July 25, 1944, was not a barrage in the classical sense. It was a sustained rolling series of massed simultaneous impacts, preceded and interspersed by heavy bomber strikes from the 8th Air Force. Fritz Bayerlein, Panzer Lehr's commander, would tell his interrogators after the war that the division that had stood at full strength 2 months earlier had effectively ceased to exist in a single morning. When the 3 American divisions jumped off into the gap, they found the ground ahead of them broken. The German defence in the target strip had been smashed, but more importantly, the nerve of the German defence everywhere behind it had been shaken. The breakout was effectively over within 72 hours. Patton's Third Army, waiting on the southern edge of the gap, was activated and sent pouring south through the corridor at Avranches, and on a front that had moved at an average of 300 metres a day through most of July, the Americans were suddenly advancing 30 kilometres a day. Which brings us back to Hitler, and Hitler's decision, against the advice of his field commanders, that the right answer to an American army that had just crushed Panzer Lehr with artillery was to send 4 panzer divisions into the same meat grinder, on open roads, in daylight. Operation Lüttich was the German name for Hitler's counterattack. It was meant to save the war in France. The American breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, had torn open the German left wing at the end of July and sent General George Patton's newly activated Third Army pouring south through a narrow corridor at the town of Avranches. If the Germans could cut that corridor, they could trap Patton's armour in Brittany. If they could not, the front in France was going to collapse in a matter of weeks. Hitler, against the advice of every senior officer on the Western Front, ordered the counterattack. Roughly 150 tanks and assault guns would lead the initial assault, with more divisions arriving piecemeal. They would strike west through the crossroads town of Mortain and drive to the coast. The operation was named after Liege, a city that had fallen to German arms in 1914 and was meant to be a talisman. The attack began in darkness and fog, just after midnight on August 7. There was no preparatory artillery bombardment, because surprise depended on silence. The German plan assumed that the 30th Infantry Division, the American unit holding the Mortain sector, had only just taken over from the 1st Infantry Division and would be caught unprepared. Bletchley Park had decoded a message that afternoon from the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, asking for Luftwaffe bombers to suppress American artillery in front of its advance. The decrypt reached General Bradley's headquarters only a few hours before the attack jumped off. It was, as Bradley said afterward, too late to do anything major, but the divisional artillery batteries had at least been told to be ready. Bradley's decision in those few hours is worth noting because it tells you something about what the Americans understood their own artillery could do. Bradley had the option of pulling the 30th Infantry Division back out of the Mortain salient before the German attack arrived. It was a tactically exposed position, held by a division that had only taken it over from the 1st Infantry Division 2 days earlier. A more cautious commander might have withdrawn. Bradley did not withdraw. He sent the 30th Division's commander, Major General Leland Hobbs, a simple instruction: hold. Bradley had concluded that the weight of American artillery in the sector, combined with the terrain, which gave observers on Hill 314 a commanding view of every road the Germans would have to use, would be enough to break the attack before it reached Avranches. He turned out to be right. But the decision was made on the basis of a belief in the artillery system that not every Allied commander would have shared, and that no German commander facing similar circumstances could have made. On the rocky summit of Hill 314, looming over the road the Germans needed, 2 forward observers from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion had dug in several days earlier. First Lieutenant Charles Bartz was from Nebraska. Second Lieutenant Robert Weiss was from Indiana, 21 years old, an Army officer for less than a year. Their radio, a signal corps set running on batteries already partly depleted when they arrived, was the only reliable communications link from the hill to the 7 American artillery battalions within range. Around them were the riflemen of the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, about 700 men in all. When the German attack struck, the battalion was surrounded. Their commander was killed early. Captain Reynold Erichson, an infantry officer, took over the defense of the hill on his own initiative. What happened over the next 5 days has been written about many times. It is in Weiss's own book, a memoir called Fire Mission, which he published decades later when he was a retired attorney in Portland, Oregon. What makes the story matter for our purposes is not courage, though the courage is real. It is mechanics. From the summit, Bartz and Weiss could see every road leading into Mortain from the east, south, and north. Every German column that tried to move toward Avranches had to pass in front of their binoculars. Weiss would see a column. He would read coordinates into his handset. The Fire Direction Center back behind the hill would take the call, evaluate the target, decide how many batteries it warranted, and transmit firing data to every battalion simultaneously. Within 3 minutes, often less, the shells would arrive. Not 1 battery's worth of shells. On a high-value target, the observer on the hill could request corps-level fire, which meant that a lieutenant with a dying radio, 21 years old, talking into a handset from behind a stone wall, could cause every American gun within roughly 20 kilometers to drop its rounds on a single piece of road. The German columns had no way to predict which road, which minute, or which piece. The first round was often the last round, because the first round arrived on top of them. By the end of the 5th day, when the 1st Battalion of the 320th Infantry from the 35th Infantry Division fought its way through to relieve Hill 314, more than 300 of the 700 Americans on the hill were dead or wounded. The battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation. Captain Erichson and 4 company commanders received the Distinguished Service Cross. Weiss and Bartz received the Silver Star. 2 months later, on October 31, 1944, Charles Bartz was killed in action near Aachen, inside Germany. He is buried in Lincoln Memorial Park in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was 26 years old. But the larger thing, the thing that mattered beyond the hill, was that the German XLV-7 Panzer Corps had been stopped, not primarily by American infantry, though the infantry had held. Not primarily by Allied air power, though air power was devastating once the fog lifted. The engine that broke the German attack was a system of artillery fire that did not exist in any other army, running on mathematics worked out in a classroom in Oklahoma a decade and a half earlier. If the story of men like Weiss, a kid of 21 sitting on a rock with a dying radio and holding back an SS Panzer division with math, means anything to you, a like on this video helps keep that story visible. The famous names from the Second World War are famous. The lieutenants with the radios are not. Mortain was not an accident. It was the system working. And to understand why the system worked as well as it did, you have to understand something about the men who operated it, because the mathematics in the Fire Direction Center was only as good as the people running it, and the people running it were not what the German army expected. The American Field Artillery Branch of 1944 was one of the largest, fastest expanded military branches in American history. In 1939, the entire United States Army had fewer than 200,000 men. By 1944, it had more than 8 million. The artillery branch grew at a rate the German army, even at its peak, never attempted. It pulled in farm boys from Iowa who had been doing their own math on seed yields since they were 12. It pulled in accountants from Chicago, engineers from Pittsburgh, school teachers from Alabama. It gave them 12 weeks of training at Fort Sill and Fort Bragg, handed them the graphic firing tables and the radio procedures, and expected them to use the tools in combat within months. This should not have worked. The German army, with the longest professional artillery tradition in Europe, could not understand how an army of amateurs could outperform their veterans. The answer is almost boring when you pick it apart. The American system was designed for amateurs. The graphic firing table did not need a gunner who could do ballistics in his head. It needed a gunner who could follow printed instructions. The German gunner, trained over 5 or 7 years, could do things on his own gun that no American could match. But he was one man doing one thing at a time. The American gunner, trained in 12 weeks, was one node in a network of hundreds of men all performing simple operations that added up, at the level of the battlefield, to something the Germans could not replicate. The same logic showed up elsewhere. From 1942 onward, the Americans attached small unarmed aircraft to their artillery battalions, usually Piper L-4s called grasshoppers. The pilots were artillery officers. Their only weapon was a radio. They flew low and slow behind the American lines, looking down into the German rear, where no ground observer could see. They radioed coordinates directly into the fire direction center. The Germans also had observation aircraft, but they used them mostly for reconnaissance and for correcting the fire of a single battery. The Americans used the grasshopper as a flying node of the whole network. A German battalion moving on a road in daylight, believing itself hidden by distance, could find itself under the fire of corps artillery 5 minutes after being seen by a Piper 10 kilometers away. And then there was the liaison officer, which was the piece the Germans almost never understood. Every American direct support artillery battalion, the kind assigned to a specific infantry regiment, sent forward observers into combat with the rifle companies, roughly 1 per company. That was already more observers than any German division fielded. But the battalion also sent a liaison officer to live at the infantry regimental headquarters. He was an artillery officer, junior but experienced, and his entire job was to listen to the infantry regiment's planning and anticipate what they would need fire on before the infantry commander had to ask for it. When a patrol reported a suspected enemy position, the liaison officer was already transmitting coordinates to the fire direction center before the patrol leader had finished his report. The infantry regiment felt as if it had its own dedicated batteries, because in every way that mattered from its point of view it did. The German infantry had nothing comparable. A German infantry captain requesting fire could wait 15 minutes in a good situation and all day in a bad one. That was one half of the answer. The other half, the part the German generals wrote around in their memoirs and almost never wrote about directly, was what had happened to German artillery in the same period. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with a first-class artillery arm. The guns were superb. The 88mm flak gun, turned against ground targets, was the most feared anti-tank weapon of the war. The 105 and 150mm howitzers were accurate and reliable. The officer corps was probably, man for man, the best trained in the world. 3 problems killed it. The first was mobility. In 1944, something close to 80% of German Infantry Division artillery was still drawn by horses. The Panzer divisions had motorized artillery, but they were a minority, and by the second half of 44 most of their motor vehicles had been destroyed, requisitioned, or could not be fueled. An American infantry division could displace an entire artillery battalion in under 3 hours. A German infantry division could not reliably move its guns at the speed of the battles its own men were fighting. The guns arrived at the front after the front had moved on. The second was ammunition. The American army produced more artillery ammunition during the war than all the other Allied and Axis armies combined. The German High Command had been warning its field commanders since 1943 that shells had to be rationed. At Anzio, to take the most extreme documented case, the Allied to German tonnage ratio on the battlefield was roughly 10-1. Across the European campaign, American guns consumed ammunition at rates German gunners could not match and often could not imagine. Anzio is worth stopping on for a moment, because Anzio was where the American artillery branch first tested what centralized corps-level fire could do in a sustained defensive fight. The Allied beachhead south of Rome, established in January 1944, came within a hair of being pushed back into the sea during the German counterattacks of February. What stopped those counterattacks, as the official American histories openly acknowledge, was the massed fire of corps artillery. The German attacks toward the beachhead ran into concentrations of fire that were heavier and more rapidly shifted from target to target than anything the attacking divisions had encountered on the Russian front. American Fifth Army documents from the period describe fire missions in which 12 to 18 battalions were brought to bear on a single German concentration within minutes of its being spotted. The German attacks did not succeed. The beachhead held, and the American field artillery branch took from that experience the confidence that the system it had been building for a decade and a half actually worked against a determined professional enemy. The third was the one that went deepest. By the second half of the war, Hitler and the German High Command had begun concentrating artillery decisions upward. The flexible, trust-based system that a well-trained German battery commander was supposed to run had been overridden by the same pattern of micromanagement that had gutted the rest of the Wehrmacht's command culture. Major concentrations had to be approved at higher and higher levels. Ammunition expenditure had to be justified in writing. Battery commanders, who in 1940 had been trusted to read their own situations and fight their own guns, by 1944 increasingly found themselves waiting for permission from headquarters that had never seen the target. It was, in its way, the mirror image of what the Americans had done. The Americans had pushed authority down. A forward observer, often a lieutenant in his early 20s, could command the fire of an entire corps guns by a single radio call. The Germans had pulled authority up. A German battery commander, in many cases, could no longer fire a mission without clearance from 3 levels above him. Slower guns, fewer shells, tighter permission, against an opposing system that was faster, better supplied, and delegated to the man at the front. That was the gap, and the Germans felt it every time it opened on top of them. An American artillery barrage was not bigger than what they had seen in Russia. It was shaped differently. It came all at once, without warning, and moved with them when they moved. It was a fundamentally different kind of problem than anything they had been trained to handle. And then, in the winter of 1944, the Americans added one more thing. The proximity fuse was the product of a wartime scientific program that historians now rank, in strategic importance, just behind the atomic bomb and behind radar. It was a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, packed into the nose of an artillery shell. When the shell came within roughly 20 feet of a solid object, the reflected signal from that object triggered the explosive charge. The result was an airburst. An airburst, unlike a ground burst, sprayed lethal fragments down across a wide radius. A man lying flat in a foxhole, safe from a ground burst, was exposed from above to an airburst. A man crouched behind a low wall was exposed from above. There was no posture, short of deep overhead cover, that offered protection. The device was small enough to fit inside a standard artillery shell, which meant it had to survive being fired from a gun barrel, which meant it had to survive forces of something like 20,000 times the force of gravity at the moment of launch. Vacuum tubes strong enough to withstand that acceleration did not exist at the start of the war. The research program that produced them, run partly by the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University and partly by private firms like Crosley and Raytheon, was dollar for dollar one of the most productive wartime scientific efforts in American history. By the peak of production in 1945, procurement contracts for the fuse had reached nearly $500 million a year. More than 100 manufacturers were involved. The final product was a device smaller than a can of soup, costing a few dollars by the end, that would reliably fire a 1942 vacuum tube circuit after being flung out of a cannon barrel. The United States Navy had been firing proximity fuses at Japanese aircraft since the cruiser USS Helena shot down a Val dive bomber off Guadalcanal on January 5, 1943. For nearly 2 years, the Pentagon had refused to release the fuse for use over land, on the theory that a dud could fall into German hands and be reverse-engineered. The combined chiefs of staff authorized limited use of the fuse against Von cruise missiles over England in June 1944, and by mid-July the new shells were destroying more than 70% of the V-1s that reached the English coastal gunbelt. The land use embargo was finally broken, not by an official decision, but by a single commander making a call on the morning of December 16, 1944. Colonel Axelson, commanding the 406th Field Artillery Group, received an emergency call from the 38th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, dug in around the town of Monschau in Germany. The cavalry troopers were being overrun by the opening assault of the German Ardennes offensive. They needed heavy fire. Axelson had the new proximity fuses in his ammunition dump. He also had standing orders not to use them over land. He looked at his situation, decided the emergency trumped the restriction, and authorized the fuses. 3 days later, on December 19, General Eisenhower formally requested clearance. 2 days after that, on December 21, all restrictions were removed across the entire Western Front. On the night of December 25 and 26, near the town of Echternach on the Sauer River, Patton's Third Army used the proximity fuse against a German battalion trying to cross the river at night. Patton wrote shortly afterward, in a letter to Major General Levin Campbell, the Chief of Army Ordnance, that the new shell was devastating and that they had killed, by actual count, 702 Germans in that single fire mission. He added that when all armies got the shell, the tactics of land warfare would have to be rewritten. North of Echternach, at a long open piece of high ground the Americans called Elsenborn Ridge, the same combination, massed artillery plus the proximity fuse, did more to wreck the German Ardennes offensive than anything else on the battlefield. The ridge was east of the twin Belgian villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath. The Americans holding it were the 2nd Infantry Division under Major General Walter Robertson and the Green 99th Infantry Division alongside it, with the 1st Infantry Division arriving on their southern flank. Behind them, on the reverse slope, the Americans had concentrated the largest continuous block of artillery the United States Army would field in Europe during the war. Battalions from every division in the sector, plus corps artillery, were pre-registered on the German avenues of approach. The 12th SS Panzer Division, leading the northern half of the German attack, went uphill in daylight against that ridge for the better part of 10 days. They did not get up it. The attacks were broken up on the slopes, and the slopes, by the end, were covered in German dead. In the Army's official history of the Ardennes campaign, the battle for Elsenborn Ridge is credited with inflicting the heaviest casualties of any single American defensive action of the Bulge on the units involved, and with forcing the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive to reroute through terrain that slowed it fatally. The artillery was the reason. If anyone in your family or in your extended family served in the Second World War, in the artillery or anywhere else, I would be grateful to read their story in the comments. The men and women in this account, the radio operators, the gun crews, the fire direction center calculators, the civilian women at Aberdeen running the slide rules, the forward observers with their dying batteries, were almost all ordinary people doing a technical job. Most of them did not realize, while they were doing it, what it was adding up to. The ones who did realize rarely talked about it afterward. The small, specific, personal details, what unit, where, what somebody remembered about the sound of the guns, are the actual record, and the only people who can preserve them are the people who carry them. There is a last piece of this story, and it is the piece that is hardest to write around. After the war, the Americans and British held extensive interviews and interrogations with captured German officers. The resulting material, much of it still held in the United States National Archives, runs to thousands of pages. When those officers were asked, not for the camera but by professional interrogators in private rooms, what had actually beaten them on the Western Front, they did not usually point first to American air power, though they respected it. They did not usually point first to American infantry, though they had come to respect that too. They pointed, with an uneasy insistence that recurs across the transcripts to American artillery. General Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer Lehr Division and who had been Rommel's chief of staff in the African desert, described the bombing and artillery that opened Operation Cobra in July 1944 as the worst moment of his career. He told his interrogators that at least 70% of his personnel had been put out of action in a single morning, and that his front lines looked like a landscape of the moon. Historians have since argued that the 70% figure was exaggerated, that his division still had about 11,000 men and more than 30 tanks a week later. But the point was not the number. The point was what Bayerlein believed, and what he passed up the chain of command. 2 days after the bombing, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge sent a courier to Bayerlein ordering him to hold his position. Bayerlein replied, in words that have become famous in the German military literature, that his grenadiers and his engineers and his tank crews were all holding their ground. They were lying silent in their foxholes, he said. They were dead. Only the dead could still hold that line. Bayerlein was captured by the Americans in April 1945, with the last remnants of Panzer Lehr in the Ruhr pocket. He lived through the war. He died in Würzburg in 1970. The transcripts of his interrogations, which are available today to anyone who wants to read them, are one of the more honest documents the German officer corps produced about what had actually happened to them between the summer of 1944 and the spring of 1945. The picture they paint is consistent with what the rest of the captured officer corps said on the same subject. They had been outproduced, out-organized, and out-communicated. They had been hit by a system of fire for which their own doctrine had no answer. The honest answer to why American artillery felt, to the Germans, impossible to survive, is not that the shells were faster than German shells. They were not. It is not that American gunners were better than German gunners. Man for man, they were not. It is that shells from different guns, different batteries, different battalions, sometimes different corps, had been trained to arrive at the same place at the same moment, on demand, because a small group of officers in a classroom in Oklahoma in the late 1920s had decided the target was the unit of artillery, and because an army of amateurs with 12 weeks of training had been handed the printed tools to make that idea work at the level of the individual gun. Carlos Brewer, the major from Fort Sill who had started the whole thing, was promoted through the war. He rose to Major General and commanded the 12th Armored Division in training. He was judged too old for combat command, and rather than accept a desk job, he voluntarily reverted from Major General to Colonel in order to command a field artillery group in 7th Army in Europe. He wanted to see his system work in a real war. He saw it. He died in 1976. Orlando Ward, who had built the Fire Direction Center with Brewer, commanded the 1st Armored Division in Tunisia, was relieved by Patton after the fighting at Maknassy, came home, and served out the war as the Field Artillery School's commandant. He died in 1972. Abbott Burns, who designed the graphic firing table, did not become a famous officer. His name appears in school histories and in technical manuals. He was the kind of man the American Army had a lot of in those years. Robert Weiss, the lieutenant on Hill 314, went home after the war and back to Indiana, then out to Oregon. He became a tax attorney. He founded a Portland law firm that is still in practice today. He wrote his book about Mortain late in his life because, as he said in the preface, the men who had been with him on the Hill deserved someone to write what had happened there. He died in Portland in 2017. He was 94. Reynold Erichson, the infantry captain who took over the defense of the Hill after its commander was killed, survived the war and lived quietly. Most of the men who actually ran the American artillery system, the thousands of fire direction, center calculators and radio operators and liaison lieutenants, came home and went back to jobs that had nothing to do with the war. Their names are not in the textbooks. If you looked in a phone book for most of them, 10 years after they came home, you would not have found them under anything more interesting than accountant, teacher, mechanic, salesman, farmer. The German officers, writing their private assessments of what had beaten them, reached for a specific kind of vocabulary, methodical, systematic. They were, in their own way, trying to describe what it felt like to fight an army that was not trying to be better than them at the art of artillery. It was trying to make the art of artillery irrelevant. The German master gunner, the man who could do ballistics in his head and walk his shells onto a target through his own craft, had been replaced on the American side by a network that did not depend on any one man being brilliant. The system was not noble. It was not a craft. It was a factory laid over a battlefield. And it worked. That was the part their professional tradition could not forgive, and mostly in the memoirs they wrote afterward, they did not try to. They said it worked, and they left it there. If you learned something from this story, the like button helps it reach the people who care about this kind of history. The men who sat in fire direction centres in Belgian farmhouses and read coordinates off printed tapes, and the women at Aberdeen who calculated the tapes, and the lieutenants with the dying radios on forgotten hills do not get many videos made about them. Subscribe if you want the next one. There are many more of these stories, about the quiet parts of the war, the parts that were decided not by charges with rifles but by careful technical work in unglamorous rooms, done by men and women whose names the public does not know. They deserve to be remembered. Not the way the newsreels remembered the war, but the way the men on the other side of the line, waiting in their holes for the shells to stop coming in, actually felt it come down on them.